Welcome to the Q Podcast.
Q is about conversation.
If we're really concerned about ending poverty, we've got to be more concerned about creating justice.
Our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture.
And God's doing amazing things. His church is expanding, his church is growing.
It's not what's the purpose of my life, it's what is the purpose that's been assigned.
Stay curious, think well, advance good. This is Q.
Welcome to another edition of the Q Ideas podcast, and today's topic is one that continues to be a conversation in American society. It seems every few weeks, every few months, there's a raised story. There's something more that points to the ways in which our history around racism creeps into the headlines because something else has happened that brings it to the broader forefront of everybody's minds, and we talk about it and we grapple with it. And it seems we also find ourselves frustrated because is change happening? And we know it is, and we see it happening in good ways, but there's also these moments that call us back to going, do I really understand what's happening here? So what we wanted to do is play one of our talks that deals with this, that has been very helpful over the last couple of years. It was given by Anthony Hendricks, called Decades of Despair, and it specifically relates to the African-American story and that journey historically and then into the beginnings of American history. And in 9 minutes, which is almost an impossible task, Anthony Hendricks covers 500 plus years of history, starting in 1453 and coming all the way to our present day. He delivered this talk in the wake of the George Floyd moment and that summer, and we hosted a conversation called Race and Repair, where we had over 10 different talks, really delving into all of the different ways we need to be thinking about and thinking well about the race conversation in America. And he led off that event with this talk, and it helped us all squarely understand where we sit, the ways in which we've understood history, things that maybe we've missed in history, and how we can better understand so that we can lead as we go forward and be part of those who are reconcilers. So as you listen into this, let's enjoy hearing Anthony give us all a brief history, certainly brief, certainly couldn't cover everything, but gives us a new perspective on how to look back at our history.
So over the past few days, I've been getting questions, calls from friends, many of them my Caucasian friends, who've been asking me a question, and I think Gabe just mentioned it, but that question is, man, how are you doing? And quite honestly, I answer that question by saying, man, I'm just tired. I'm tired emotionally. I'm tired at the depths of my soul. And I would guarantee you that most of the African American community would answer the question the same way, because what we're going through in the last month, 2, 3 months, 40 years, 400 years is nothing different to us. Our community has been walking through this for many years. And so I wanted to take some time today to kind of get you from back then and how back then affects our now. And so it really began not in this country, but it really began in England in 1453 and 1526, two very important dates, because those are the 2 days when the first, or the years when the first books that included racist ideas were created. That is the first one by a guy by the name of Zorora, who wrote a book on Africans, although he had only been to one particular place in Africa, not in the entire continent. It's like somebody coming to discover our country here and going to North Dakota and making a judgment on everybody in the United States. But that's how it was. They became these specialists on the people of Africa. And then there's a guy by the name of Leo Africanus in 1526, who kind of piggybacked off of Zorora's book, and he wrote a manuscript, again, on Africans. And I want you to hear what they said in their book. Here are the racist ideas that were put forth: that Africans were naturally inferior. We were naturally lazy, naturally lawless, naturally oversexed, naturally aggressive, and beastly in nature. And if you think about those terms that I just mentioned, you can see how they have made their way through the generations of America. As a matter of fact, in 1607 was the first settlement of the Englishmen. And not only did the Englishmen settle in Jamestown, Virginia, but racist ideas also settled. And so those racist ideas that had culminated themselves in England had made their way to Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. And then in 1619, the first slaves made their way to Jamestown, Virginia. And because Mother England wanted a lot of tobacco and a lot of cotton, our colonists needed labor to harvest all of this stuff. And so the first slaves arrived here on American soil, Jamestown, Virginia, in 1619. And they served for about 200 years until the country began to move westward. And that westward expansion began to drum up some questions about the morality of slavery, in addition to the fight of the abolitionists. And so that eventually created this war. In 1861, we know it as the Civil War. And that Civil War was fought until in 1865, it ended. And you think that in 1865, along with the Civil War ending, that this immoral institution called slavery ended as well. But hold on. In 1865, even though the war ended, and even though the 13th Amendment, which was actually the amendment that did free the slaves, it was not the Emancipation Proclamation, but the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment has been passed, and they're all laws that gave rights to African Americans. So great, we're free. But hold on. Abraham Lincoln is assassinated on Good Friday in 1865, and Andrew Johnson, a known racist, comes into power, and he basically rewrites all of Abraham Lincoln's cabinet's laws. And Reconstruction, as it was known, crumbles. And so at that point, you have a couple of things that are really important and still exist to today that were birthed. Jim Crow, which was basically legalized, enforced racism, was started in 1865. The Ku Klux Klan was birthed in 1865 under Johnson's tutelage. And then finally, there was this mass migration of African Americans that wanted to flee the South and all of the things that were going on here in the South, lynchings and improper treatment. And they made their way to the North thinking that that was the promised land. Unfortunately, when they got to the promised land, the so-called promised land, they also recognized that this thing called racism and even Jim Crow laws were themselves too existing in the North. And so they would go in to get jobs, and many of these African Americans were educated people, but they were relegated to menial jobs of cleaning, while Europeans who were just immigrating to this country, who didn't know the language nor the culture, were getting the better jobs simply because of the color of their skin. And as I'm walking through history, one of my main questions is this: where was the white community of faith? Fast forward to 1930s, reeling off of a economic depression, our country, the president of our country, Theodore Roosevelt, came up with what we know as the New Deal. And what I'd like for you to know about our history is that the New Deal was no deal for the African American, because we primarily were excluded from most of the New Deal policies. And so as America was redeeming itself, getting itself back on its feet, the African American community was exclusively set apart from those new laws. 30 years of loan exclusivity. For 30 years, we were not allowed to get loans to be able to purchase property, to begin to gain the equity that this country now enjoys. Fast forward to the 1940s. We're in another world war now, World War II. And though we've been treated improperly and unjustly, many of our men are making their way into the war to fight for the freedoms of this country. And as we fought for the freedoms of this country, you would think that when we return, we're treated with the utmost respect, but that wasn't the case. The GI Bill was passed to help our soldiers as they've come back from war. And in that GI Bill, three things were supposed to happen. Hospitals were supposed to be created. There were supposed to be low-interest mortgages that were available for all of our military. and college tuitions were supposed to be provided for our military men. But yet again, while white men who went to war were coming back home and applying and getting these low interest loans and going to school based upon government funded programs, African Americans were largely excluded from those issues, those programs. Again, where is the church? Where is our white brothers and sisters of faith? 1960, the 60s. Some would say, man, the 60s were great for African Americans. And in some ways it was. The civil rights movement took flight in the late 50s and into the 60s. And I love the civil rights movement because it primarily was motivated by men and women of faith in the black community. So the Civil Rights Bill was passed in 64. Following that, the Voting Rights Act is passed in 65. Fair Housing Act is passed in 68. The problem with all of these is there was no government agency that was enforcing any of these things. And so what happens is when you have people who have been motivated by those same racist ideas that I mentioned earlier, instituting these laws, then what happens is people find end arounds to the laws that have passed. And so the 1960s was a great time, but here come the 1970s through the 1980s. And during that time, there were three new mindsets that were born during that time. One was the war on drugs, the other was law and order, and the other was the rule of law. These were new concepts that were talked about by men and women at the highest levels of our government. And what they basically were was opportunities to come against the African American community, and in particular, the African American male. My question is this: wouldn't it be great for us as the community of believers to rewrite history starting today, June the 9th, 2020? The church awakens and becomes the Micah 6:8 community that it should have been back in 1619. A community that does justice, a community that loves mercy, and a community that walks humbly before their God. Thank you.
Well, I hope that was helpful for you as you got to listen in on Anthony's passion as well as his knowledge about the history and where we've come from. And I hope as you continue to explore talks and topics on Q Media that you can explore other topics around our playlist related to race and this entire event called Race and Repair that I think you'd greatly enjoy and will create amazing conversations about the way forward. So you can start your free trial at qideas.org/trial.